There's something nobody will tell you honestly about education. The most formidable minds in any field, the people who see what others miss, who connect ideas that nobody else thought to connect, who work problems through to conclusions that surprise even the experts. Almost none of them got that way through formal education. They got that way because at some point they stopped waiting for someone to teach them and started taking complete responsibility for their own understanding. Not by reading more, not by taking more courses, by learning differently, by going deeper than any school would ever ask them to go. Miyamoto Musashi had no formal education, no school, no master who completed his training. He taught himself across 60 duels, across decades of solitary study in strategy, philosophy, calligraphy, painting, and war, and he became one of the most formidable minds Japan ever produced. Not because he was gifted, because he had a system, 7 principles drawn from what he later wrote in the Book of 5 Rings. Each one targets a specific way that most people fail to truly learn. This video is about that system. Subscribe and let's begin. The story behind the principles. Japan 1600. Miyamoto Musashi is 16 years old. He has just killed his first opponent in a duel. An experienced warrior named Aram Kihei who accepted a challenge from a boy and expected an easy victory. He did not get one. Musashi walks away from the duel with something most people in his position would not have. Not pride, a question, why did that work? Not how, why? What was the principle underneath the technique that made it work when it should not have worked? What did he understand that his opponent did not? He sits with this question for days. This is the moment that separates Musashi from every other fighter of his era. Not the victory, the question after the victory, the refusal to simply take the win and move on. He will spend the next 50 years asking the same kind of question after every experience, every duel, every painting, every sculpture, every strategic decision, every mistake. Not what happened, why it happened. What is the principle underneath? This habit of mind, the relentless pursuit of the principle underneath the surface is what the Book of 5 Rings actually is. Not a manual of techniques, a record of 50 years of asking why, 7 principles from that record, each one a different way Musashi approached learning that most people never use. Principle 1, Kai no Miyai, the ground before the movement. Know the foundation before you move. Musashi writes in the Book of 5 Rings that a warrior must first understand the ground before he fights on it, not during the fight before. He applied this to everything he learned. Before studying a new domain, he would spend time only with what he already knew about it, mapping the territory he already occupied, finding where his current knowledge ended. Most people do the opposite. They begin consuming new material immediately. The book arrives and they open it. The course starts and they follow along. They accumulate new information on top of existing confusion. Musashi called this fighting on ground you do not know. You cannot see what the new information is replacing because you have not seen clearly what was already there. There is a specific problem this creates. When you do not know what you already know, you cannot tell the difference between something you are learning for the first time and something you are re-encountering in a different form. New words for an old idea feel like new knowledge. They are not, but because you never mapped what you already had, you cannot recognize the overlap. Musashi had no patience for this. Before every new study, before every new domain, before returning to something he had left for a while, he mapped the ground. 20 minutes, no material, just the question, what do I actually know about this right now? Not what he thought he knew, what he could demonstrate, what he could explain, what he could use, could. Then he looked at the edges where the sentences became uncertain, where the explanations ran out, where he was guessing rather than knowing. Those edges were the most valuable thing the mapping produced, not what he knew, where the knowing stopped because that was exactly where the new learning needed to go. Kai no Mi is the practice of mapping the ground before you move on to new territory. The practice, before your next study session, spend 20 minutes writing only what you already know about the subject. No material, no notes, just what is actually in your head right now. Then look at the edges of what you wrote. That is where the session should focus. Most people consume material without knowing what they are missing. Musashi always knew what he was missing before he looked for it. That is the difference between learning and accumulating. Principle 2, Mizuno Kokoro, the water mind, the mind that does not resist what it receives. Musashi writes, the mind should be like water without fixed form, able to take the shape of whatever it encounters. He observed that most students came to learning with their conclusions already formed. They read to confirm what they already believed. They encountered ideas that challenged their understanding and dismissed them quickly. They were not learning, they were defending. A mind that defends cannot absorb. Water does not argue with the vessel. It takes its shape completely and then moves on. One afternoon, a student came to Musashi convinced that a particular strategy was wrong. He had reasons, they were logical, he presented them well. Musashi listened. Sit with it for one day, he said, not to be convinced to understand it fully before you decide. The student came back the next day. His objections were still there, but they were sharper, more specific, and 2 of them had dissolved when he understood the strategy more completely. Now your disagreement is real, Musashi said. Before it was just resistance. Mizunaro is not about agreeing with everything. It is about the specific discipline of fully understanding an idea before deciding what you think of it. Most people decide while they are still learning. The idea arrives, the reaction forms, and the learning stops at the point where the reaction began. Musashi's water mind holds the idea completely before responding to it. The practice: when you encounter an idea that contradicts something you believe, write down the idea in its strongest possible form before writing your objection. Not your summary of it, its strongest version, the best case for it. Then write your objection. The objection that comes after full understanding is worth something. The one that comes before is just noise. Principle 3, hey-ho, strategy as a way of living. Apply what you learn to everything, not just the obvious. Musashi writes that the principles of strategy apply not just to combat, but to everything. The merchant uses strategy, the craftsman uses strategy, the scholar uses strategy. The same principles govern all of them. He spent his life proving this. The lessons from swordsmanship informed his painting. The lessons from painting informed his calligraphy. The lessons from calligraphy informed his strategy. Each domain was a different expression of the same underlying principles. Most people learn in silos. What they learn in one domain stays in that domain. The business book stays in the business section of the mind. The philosophy stays in the philosophy section. They never meet. Musashi refused this separation. Every time he learned something in one domain, he immediately asked, where else does this apply? What other domain is governed by the same principle? This practice produced connections that specialists who had studied one domain their entire lives had never noticed. Not because Musashi was smarter, because he was always looking for the principle underneath the technique, and principles, unlike techniques, transfer. Hi-ho is the practice of applying what you learn to domains beyond the one you learned it in, not as metaphor, as genuine inquiry. Does this principle actually operate in other areas? Where? How? The person who learns a principle in one domain and immediately asks where else it applies doubles the value of every learning session they do. The practice after every significant learning session: music, write down one principle you encountered, not a fact, a principle, something that governs how something works. Then write 2 other domains where the same principle might operate, test it. Does it hold? Where does it break down? This practice builds the kind of cross-domain thinking that makes a person genuinely formidable. The person who sees the same principle operating in 10 different places understands it more deeply than the person who has only seen it in one. Principle 4, Zanshin, the attention that remains. Stay with what you have learned after the session ends. In Japanese martial arts, Zanshin is the awareness that remains after a technique is completed. The strike lands, but the attention does not relax. It remains present with what just happened and what might come next. Musashi applied this to learning. Most people close the book and the learning stops. The session is over. The mind moves on to the next thing. The material is left where it was unprocessed. They consumed it. They did not digest it. The difference between consuming and digesting is time. specifically the unstructured time after the session where the mind works on what it just received without being given anything new to receive. Most people fill this time immediately. Another video, another article, another conversation. The new material arrives before the previous material has settled. And what does not settle does not become understanding. It becomes the kind of information you can mention in conversation but cannot use when you need it. Musashi stayed with what he had just encountered, not immediately reviewing it, sitting with it, letting it settle, asking the question he always asked, what is the principle underneath this? What have I not yet understood? What in this will turn out to be wrong? This last question was particularly important to him. He had watched students become confident too quickly. They understood the surface of something and closed the inquiry. The surface understanding calcified into a false certainty that prevented them from seeing more deeply later. The student who is certain they understand something is the student who has stopped learning it. Zanshin in learning is the practice of remaining with material after the session ends. Not consuming more, sitting with what you have. 5 minutes after every session, no new input. One question written down, what from this session will probably turn out to be incomplete. Not wrong necessarily, incomplete. What am I likely to understand differently in 6 months when I know more? This question keeps the inquiry open. It prevents the false certainty that stops learning, and it is almost always answered correctly. There is almost always something in every session that you are seeing too simply. Zanshin is what keeps you from mistaking that simplicity for understanding. The practice after every study session before you close the material or move to something else. Write down one thing you are probably understanding too simply right now, not to fix it immediately, to mark it, to return to it when you know more. The learning that stays open produces more than the learning that closes. Musashi spent 50 years asking the same question after every experience. What is the principle underneath? If this is changing how you think about your own learning, like this video, one tap. Now we continue with the final 3 principles. Principle 5, Mu no Kokoro, the mind of emptiness. Learn outside your domain to understand your domain. Musashi writes in the Book of 5 Rings about the void. The 5th book, the shortest, the most misunderstood. The void is not nothingness. It is the state of a mind that has released its fixed categories and can therefore see what is actually there. Musashi practiced this by studying domains completely unrelated to his expertise. He was a swordsman who painted music, who did calligraphy, who made sculpture, who studied Zen, who read philosophy not as hobbies, as deliberate practices that showed him his own domain from outside. Every time he returned to strategy from painting, he saw something in strategy he had not seen before. The painting had given him a new angle, a new way of asking the question. The expert who never leaves their domain becomes trapped in its assumptions. They can no longer see the assumptions because the assumptions have become invisible. They are simply how things are. Mu no Kokoro is the practice of deliberately learning outside your domain, not to become an expert in something else, to return to your domain with fresh eyes. Once a week, 1 hour, a subject completely unrelated to what you primarily study, not to master it, to look at how it works, to ask, what are the assumptions of this field? What does it take for granted that my field does not? Then return to your primary domain and ask the same question from the outside. What does strategy take for granted that painting questions? What does calligraphy assume that swordsmanship does not? These questions produce insights that years of staying inside one domain cannot produce. The practice once a week, spend 1 hour studying something completely outside your main domain. Afterward, write one question that this outside domain asks that your main domain never asks. Bring that question to your main domain, see what it reveals. Principle 6. Gen knowledge only through action, the understanding that only comes from doing. Musashi is direct about this in the Book of 5 Rings. Strategy that has never been tested is not strategy. It is theory wearing the clothes of strategy. He had seen it repeatedly. Scholars who could discuss strategy brilliantly but who could not execute it when the conditions were real. The discussion had produced confidence without producing competence. They knew the map but had never walked the territory. The map and the territory are not the same thing. Every map simplifies. Every map leaves things out. Every map represents the territory as it was when the map was drawn, not as it is now. The person who mistakes the map for the territory will walk confidently into walls that are not on the map. The only way to find out where the map is wrong is to walk the territory. Musashi's system had no space for purely theoretical knowledge. Every principle had to meet action. Every understanding had to be tested against real conditions. The knowledge that could not survive contact with reality was not knowledge, it was decoration. He wrote, "You cannot understand something by thinking about it. You understand it by doing it badly, then less badly, then well. The badly is not a failure, it is the most valuable part. The badly is where the theory shows you what it got wrong, where the model meets the territory and they do not match. That mismatch is where the real learning is. Most people avoid the badly. They study more instead of doing badly. They read another book instead of writing the bad first draft. They watch another video instead of making the bad first attempt. The bad first attempt would teach them more than 10 more hours of study, but it requires being bad at something in front of themselves, which is uncomfortable." Musashi had no patience for this comfort. He had been bad at things his entire life, deliberately, repeatedly, because he understood that the badly was where the learning actually happened. Every duel where his technique failed taught him something 1,000 perfect practice repetitions could not. Every painting that did not come alive showed him something about presence and forcing that no amount of study could reveal. Every failed application was the most specific feedback available. The practice for every significant thing you are currently studying. Identify one way to apply it within 2 weeks, not a plan to apply it eventually. A specific application, a specific situation, real conditions. The knowledge that meets real conditions in 2 weeks is worth more than the knowledge that stays theoretical for 2 years. Apply it badly. Learn from the badly, apply it again. Principle 7, Surusamichi, the path of scattered thoughts. Write what remains, not what was said. This is the principle Musashi never named directly, but it is visible throughout everything he wrote. The Book of Five Rings is not a systematic textbook. It is the record of what remained in Musashi's mind after 50 years of learning and doing. Not what he read, not what his teachers told him, what stayed, what proved itself durable enough to survive the contact with reality across decades. He did not write notes during his learning, he wrote after. He wrote what had survived the processing, what had become genuinely his rather than what he had borrowed from somewhere else. This is the distinction most people miss entirely. Notes are a record of what someone else said or wrote. They keep the knowledge outside you in the notebook, accurate and retrievable but not transformed. You can read them back later and they sound correct, but they are not yours. They are still the author's thoughts in your handwriting. The test is simple. Close your notes, try to explain the idea from memory. What comes out is what you actually understand. The gap between that and what your notes say is the gap between what you absorbed and what you merely recorded. Treasurusa no Michai makes that gap visible every session. You close the material you write, only what remained in your mind without looking, not the author's argument, your understanding of it, not what was said. What survived the gap between what was said and what survived is exactly what you do not yet understand. If the author made 5 points and only 2 survived in your mind, those 3 missing points are where the learning needs to go. Not because you forgot them, because they did not yet find a place in your understanding to attach to. They had no hook, no connection to what you already knew, and things without hooks do not stay. This is actually useful information. Those 3 points that did not survive are not random. They are the specific parts of the subject where your existing understanding is thin, where you need to build more foundation before the new material can attach. The writing shows you this. The notes hide it because the notes contain everything the author said, which makes it look like you have everything when what you actually have is a record of what someone else understood. Musashi kept records like this across his life, not summaries of what he had studied, records of what had become part of how he thought. The Book of Five Rings is the final form of those records. It is why the book does not read like a textbook. It reads like a mind because it is one the practice. After every significant study session, close all material, write for 10 minutes. Not what you read, what is still in your mind, what stayed, what connected to something you already knew, what surprised you, what you are not sure you understood. Do not look at your notes while writing, do not look at the material, write only what remained, then compare what you wrote to what the material actually said. The gaps are your learning agenda for the next session, not the material's agenda. Yours. This is Chiragusa-no-mi, the path of what remains, what the dangerously self-educated person becomes. Years later, Musashi is in the cave on Mount Wadao writing the Book of Five Rings. He is not summarizing what he read. He is recording what remained after 50 years of applying these 7 principles to everything he encountered. The result is not a comprehensive manual, it is a formidable mind made visible on paper. When you bring these 7 principles together, something specific happens over time. You begin every new subject by mapping what you already know. So the new learning goes exactly where it is needed rather than piling on top of confusion. You hold new ideas fully before you respond to them. So your disagreements are real and your agreements are genuine rather than both being reactions. You ask where every principle applies beyond the domain you learned it in. So your understanding compounds across domains rather than staying siloed. You stay with material after the session ends, so the learning deepens rather than stopping at the surface. You regularly study outside your domain, so you can see your own assumptions from the outside rather than being trapped inside them. You apply everything to real conditions as quickly as possible. So your knowledge becomes operational rather than decorative. You write what remained, not what was said, so you always know exactly what you actually understand and where the real gaps are. This combination produces something that most people never build, not more knowledge, a different relationship with knowledge itself. The person who has built this relationship reads less than most people around them and understands far more because every piece of material has been genuinely absorbed rather than merely passed through. They see things other people miss not because they have read more, because they have understood more deeply what they have read, because they have tested it against reality and found where it breaks. Because they have mapped the edges of their knowledge and gone directly to where it stops. They cannot be easily misled because they know the difference between understanding an idea and recognizing it, between a map that says the territory looks a certain way and actually walking the territory. They carry a quiet confidence that does not require external validation because they know exactly what they understand and exactly where the edges of their understanding currently lie. The honest map, the real territory, that is what Musashi built across 50 years. The same system is available to you, not in 50 years, starting with one principle. The one that reveals the biggest gap between how you currently learn and how you could start there. Miyamoto Musashi died in 1645 in the cave on Mount 2 months after finishing the Book of Five Rings. He had spent 50 years learning everything he could about everything that interested him. Without formal education, without a single master who stayed with him long enough to complete his training, what he left behind was not a credential, not a degree, not a title. A book 60 pages written in a cave by a man who had spent 50 years asking why. That book is still read 300 years later by people trying to understand not just strategy, but mastery itself. Not just how Musashi fought, but how he thought. The 7 principles in this video are drawn from what that thinking produced. Not as a system Musashi named and codified, as what becomes visible when you read carefully what he wrote and ask, how did this mind work? What did it do that most minds do not? Kai no mi, map the ground before you move. Mizu no kokoro, hold the idea before you judge it. Haiho, find the principle and apply it everywhere. Zanshin tino no, stay with the learning after the session ends. Mu no kokoro, leave your domain to see it clearly. Jason, apply it badly, learn from the badly. Sheirusa no mi, write what remained, not what was said. 7 principles, start with one. The one that makes you most uncomfortable is probably the one you need most. Comment below what is the one principle you are starting with. Subscribe to Belk Belt Discipline for ancient wisdom tested by time and confirmed by science. New video every week. Musashi had no teacher who completed his education. He completed it himself, so can you.